It's quiet in the house, the kind of quiet that makes you listen for every small sound. A door closes, a toilet flush, perhaps, or the shuffle of footsteps on the tile. Then, 4 bangs. 4 shots fired into a small, locked cubicle. By the time anyone breaks the door, there's a woman bleeding, and a man bent over her trying to hold life in place with his hands and a cricket bat. This is the night, February 14, 2013, that changed 2 families forever and sent questions ricocheting through courts, headlines, and private conversations for more than a decade. Today on Still Unanswered, we stop at those echoing questions rather than the spectacle. What remains unresolved about the death of Reeva Steenkamp and the conviction of Oscar Pistorius? I'm Nadia Mokoena. If you've been with this show before, you know our work. We don't chase the lurid or the quick fix. We return to cases where evidence, law, and lived harm intersect, and where answers still feel incomplete. With me is Dr. Callum Hargreaves, a criminal law scholar and former prosecutor who's written about intent, dolus eventualis, and the collisions between media and justice. Callum, welcome.
Thanks, Nadia. It's good to be here, though I have to say, this is one of those cases you think you understand until you actually begin to unpack it slowly.
We'll be methodical. We'll walk the timeline. We'll discuss legal concepts, dolus eventualis, culpable homicide, the SCA's interventions, and we'll keep asking the question that still divides public opinion. Did he know it was Reeva behind that door? But first, let's take 2 lives apart from the moment of violence, so we don't reduce Reeva to a footnote or Oscar to a headline. Callum, can I ask you to hold that as a frame while we go back?
Absolutely. Put the person back into the story. That's critical. It's where the legal and moral analyses should start.
Good. So, Oscar Pistorius, the miracle story, the Blade Runner, privileged Johannesburg childhood, amputation as an infant, an athletic career that became a global narrative about overcoming disability, Paralympic golds, world records, and that court victory to run in able-bodied meets. He was marketable, charismatic, held up as a symbol. But beneath that polish were quieter, darker brushstrokes, an intense infatuation with guns, episodes of volatility, and relationships that friends later said were marked by jealousy. These contradictions, heroic narrative and troubling behavior, matter. They matter legally and morally.
Yes. And if you listen to the pre-2013 coverage, the story was almost celebratory. Breakthrough athlete, a man whose prosthetics made him a global icon. But the evidence we see later in the trial reintroduces a different picture, one where firearms are not just a leisure activity, and where jealousy and control surface as recurring motifs. For a prosecutor, those are red flags you don't ignore.
Right. And Reeva Steenkamp, she deserves to be described fully because so often in the avalanche of coverage, victims are flattened into templates. Reeva was born in 1983, a law graduate working as a paralegal, an aspiring advocate. She modeled, yes, and had media roles, but she also wanted to speak out against violence toward women. There's a bitter irony. She was scheduled to speak to schoolgirls about self-worth and safety on Valentine's Day, and instead, she did not survive the morning. She loved cooking, family time, and had plans, professional and personal. Her parents, Barry and June, would go on to become the human core of this long story.
There's something important there about agency. Reeva was not just a victim in a headline. She had professional ambitions, a legal education, and a public interest in speaking on violence against women. That context complicates the narrative, where the focus becomes solely the celebrity who killed her. It's necessary for moral clarity to keep returning to who she was.
Yes, and also, people often ask, how long had they been together? Short. Their relationship began in November 2012, 3 months before the shooting. Intense, public, and, according to friends and messages, sometimes fraught. WhatsApp messages read in court showed a tone of worry from Reeva, mentions of jealousy, guns, and moments where she said she felt scared. That's part of the texture we can't ignore.
Those messages were picked over in the trial for what they signaled about the emotional climate in the relationship, but legally they're not determinative of what happened in the bathroom that night. They frame motive and context, though. They're the kinds of background that prosecutors use to build a likely sequence of a fight or escalating control.
Let's rewind to the night itself. I want to reconstruct it slowly, sound by sound, decision by decision. Callum, when you hear the sequence laid out, what strikes you first from a legal or evidentiary perspective?
The first thing is the sheer physicality of the act. 4 shots through a locked cubicle in a small bathroom. Any use of lethal force in a confined domestic space raises immediate questions about perception, visibility, and proportionality. But beyond that, the contested elements, whether he was on his stumps, whether he called out, whether he had reason to believe someone was in imminent danger, those are subtle, technical issues that became decisive in court.
Okay, timeline. Sometime after midnight, they go to bed. Pistorius says he woke to a noise. He says he was on his stumps, no prosthetics. He believes there's an intruder, yells, hears no reply, approaches the bathroom and fires 4 times through the locked cubicle door. 3 bullets hit Reeva, hip, arm, head, and she dies. He then breaks the door with a cricket bat, carries her downstairs, and calls for help. Neighbors heard shouting. Some testified they heard a woman screaming before the shots. The defense said that was Oscar himself raising his voice in panic and perhaps in pain. That single contested detail, who was screaming and when, really encapsulates how small sensory facts can loom enormous.
It does. Sound evidence is notoriously difficult. Distance, acoustics, windows, and the listener's expectation all work against reliable identification. For legal purposes, neighbor testimony can be powerful emotionally, but less precise scientifically. The state did, however, try to combine witness statements with ballistic and trajectory analysis to show the shots were fired while Pistorius was wearing prosthetics, placing him higher than his stump account would allow.
Let's unpack that. Pistorius's story about being on his stumps was central to his claim of vulnerability and fear. Without prosthetics, he said he felt trapped, at a disadvantage, couldn't sprint to check the cubicle, and thus acted to neutralize a perceived threat. Critics argued his prostheticless account was inconsistent with forensic evidence indicating higher firing arcs. Callum, what does the ballistic evidence actually show, and how did the courts treat it?
The ballistic and trajectory analyses were disputed among experts. Some testified that the entry wounds and angles suggested shots fired from a higher position, consistent with him standing on prosthetics. The defense countered with alternative angles, the possibility of movement, and the limitations of reconstructing exact posture from wound trajectories. Judge Masipa in 2014 did not find beyond reasonable doubt that he knew it was Reeva or that he foresaw death as probable. She accepted the possibility he was on his stumps. But the Supreme Court of Appeal later said the judge had misapplied the law on dolus eventualis, and that, given the evidence, a reasonable person should have foreseen death as a consequence of firing into an occupied cubicle.
Which brings us to this crucial legal concept that many listeners ask about, dolus eventualis. Callum, break it down for us in plain terms.
Dolus eventualis is a form of intent recognized in South African law and in various forms elsewhere, where a person foresees the possibility that their action could cause death, but proceeds anyway, reconciled to that outcome. Think of it like this. If you fire a gun into a closed, confined space where someone is present, and you appreciate there's a real risk they might die, yet you go ahead, that can be dolus eventualis. It's distinct from premeditated murder, but it still imputes culpability because the actor accepted the risk of death.
So the SCA concluded that firing 4 shots into the cubicle, given the layout and the obvious likelihood of hitting a person, amounted to dolus eventualis, even if he claimed he thought there was an unknown intruder?
Yes, the SCA's point was procedural and normative. The trial judge made findings on what was shown beyond reasonable doubt, but in their view, she downplayed the logical inference that when you shoot into a small closed space at human height, you accept the risk of killing whoever is inside. The SCA replaced the culpable homicide verdict with murder, specifically rejecting the idea that this was merely negligent or reckless in the lesser sense.
That legal shift, culpable homicide to murder, was pivotal, and it divided public sentiment. When Masipa first handed a culpable homicide conviction and sentenced Pistorius to 5 years, there was outrage. People said a man shot a woman 4 times in her home and got only 5 years. Later, the SCA upped the conviction to murder and ultimately pushed the sentence to over 13 years. But the public conversation wasn't just about months and years. It was about message. What does this say about gender-based violence, about celebrity, about the weight of disability in sentencing? But the public conversation wasn't just about months and years. It was about message.
Exactly. Sentencing is where the law meets moral judgment and social norms. Masipa's initial sentence included mitigation remorse, his disability, the idea he was a first-time offender, and that was within judicial discretion. But the SCA's intervention signaled that the broader values around protecting vulnerable people and condemning killings in domestic settings required a stiffer response. It's also worth noting the SCA explicitly called the 6-year sentence for murder shockingly lenient, which is language that reflects a clear judicial rebuke.
I want to pause for a beat and acknowledge that for many listeners, the legal distinctions, dolus eventualis, culpable homicide, are secondary to the human feeling that justice didn't feel delivered for Reeva. Callum, as someone who prosecutor trained, how do you respond to the sense that the system fiddled while a life was lost and that celebrity influenced outcomes?
I understand the sentiment. From the bench or the bar, we try to apply principles consistently. In high-profile cases, however, the presence of celebrity can cut both ways. Some judges might be harder on a famous defendant to avoid perceptions of indulgence. Others, uneasy with mitigating factors like disability, may be more sympathetic. The SCA's eventual increase suggests judicial oversight working. The appeals process corrected what it saw as error. But appeals are not remedies for grief. They adjust legal consequences. They don't replace what Reeva's family lost.
Which brings us to the family, Barry and June. Their grief threaded the entire case, public and private. They were deeply involved, attending hearings, and later participated in restorative justice sessions with Pistorius. June said publicly she never believed the intruder story. Barry died in 2023. The restorative justice meetings, what can they do in a case where facts and motive remain contested?
Restorative justice is about human processes, acknowledgement, apology, the chance for victims' families to ask questions. It can be meaningful when the offender accepts responsibility. But when key facts, like motive or knowledge, are still in dispute, restorative processes can feel incomplete. They might provide some solace, but they can't compel truth beyond what the offender is willing to disclose.
June later said Pistorius didn't fully answer their questions and that she left feeling like he was still lying. That resonates with a lot of families who say, even after legal closure, the moral closure never comes. We should also talk about the media. This was one of the first trials beamed globally, live, with Twitter and round-the-clock commentary. Did trial by media help or hurt justice in this case?
Media kept the case transparent in ways that older trials never were. People around the world saw courtroom testimony and evidence. That can be salutary. Public scrutiny of the justice system is healthy. But there's a downside. The court of public opinion often overlays emotional verdicts and conspiracy. It can pressure courts indirectly, and it certainly traumatizes families anew with every retelling. There were also the phenomena of armchair forensics, people debating wound angles and timings without the evidentiary restraint that a court demands.
We can't talk about the media without returning to the question that fuels much of the obsession. Did he know it was Reeva? Legally, the SCA said he foreseen the possibility of death, but did he specifically know it was Reeva? The courts never made an explicit finding that he knew with personal certainty it was her in the cubicle. Why does that nuance matter so much?
Because knowing it was Reeva goes to motive and personhood of the act. If he knowingly shot at his partner behind a closed door after an argument, many would say that's qualitatively different than firing because you genuinely believed there was a stranger intruder. Legally, though, the SCA's position is that you don't need that personal knowledge of identity for dolus eventualis to attach. You need instead the appreciation that a person, whoever they are, might be killed by your action and that you accepted that risk.
So the law allows for a murder conviction even without proof that he knew the identity of the person. But socially, morally, people seem unwilling to let go of the question of whether this was an argument that escalated, whether there was a pattern of controlling behavior that culminated in violence. What do you make of the WhatsApp messages and the pattern of jealousy in that light?
Those messages suggest a relationship with tension and fear. In court, they help corroborate a narrative of escalating control or volatility. But it's also true that people in troubled relationships often have complicated communications, apologies, reconciliations, confessions of fear. From a prosecutorial standpoint, however, pattern evidence like that can help build a background that makes the state's theory more coherent. A fight, Reeva fleeing and locking a door, then being shot.
There's another thread we must walk carefully. Pistorius's disability. He used his amputee status in court as both context and mitigation, saying he was more vulnerable and therefore more fearful in the dark. Critics argued disability softened his culpability in a way that's troubling. How do we reconcile the legitimate reality of his physical vulnerability with the objection that his disability was used to deflect accountability?
It's a difficult balance. Disability is a real fact about someone's lived experience and, in fairness, may alter how they perceive threats or what they can physically do in a crisis. But disability should not function as a get-out-of-liability card. Courts must weigh it honestly as a circumstantial factor without allowing it to eclipse the core legal question. Did the defendant adopt conduct that a reasonable person would realize could kill someone? In the sentencing phase, touching on disability as a mitigating factor is legitimate, but it becomes problematic if it leads to a sentence that doesn't reflect the gravity of taking a life.
And that's why activists were furious when he was initially given a 5-year sentence. They saw it as a miscarriage of justice in a country where intimate partner femicide is tragically common. Did the ultimate sentence, 13 years and 5 months, satisfy those critics?
It moderated some of the initial anger. The increase signaled formal condemnation. But for many advocates, the question isn't simply years served. It's the broader pattern. Do we have systems, social attitudes, and policing that take intimate partner violence seriously? Did this case change practice? The answer is mixed. It raised awareness globally, but systemic reform is slow.
And then there's parole. He became eligible, underwent restorative processes, and was released on parole in January 2024 with conditions: restricted travel, therapy, anger management, community service, reporting obligations. That release stirred renewed controversy. For people who follow gender-based violence issues, seeing him live in a leafy suburb, participating in triathlons, reportedly dating, these images reopen wounds. There's a visceral sense that private life after loss feels unjust to the family. What does the parole process try to balance legally?
Parole is about balancing punishment, public safety, and rehabilitation. If an offender meets criteria, behavioral assessments, participation in programs, and a parole board's judgment, the law permits supervised reintegration. It's procedurally standard. But not all harms are satisfiable by procedure. Public outrage often reflects a moral calculus that legal mechanisms are not designed to answer fully.
I want to read a line from Reeva Steenkamp. She said, "I needed to see him own what he did." That's the human heart of the story. The legal system demands standards of proof and formal findings. Families desire moral truth and accountability that sometimes go beyond judicial pronouncements.
And restorative justice tries to bridge that gap, but it requires candor from the offender. If the offender maintains a narrative mistaken intruder, that leaves key questions open. Families can feel betrayed even after the sentence is served.
We've talked law, we've talked context. Let's come back to the unanswered questions. Briefly lay them out and interrogate them. Number 1. Did he know it was Reeva? We've covered the legal settlement. No definitive judicial finding of identity knowledge, but a murder conviction on dolus eventualis. Number 2. Did his disability influence the sentencing unduly? Number 3. What message does the case send in a society struggling with gender-based violence? Number 4. Did media exposure help or distort justice? And 5. Can restorative measures ever be sufficient when factual questions remain contested?
Those are the correct 5. Each has its own complexity. I'd add a 6th. Would the outcome have been different if the defendant were not famous or white or affluent? It's a hard question, but one worth asking in comparative terms.
Yes, and to that point, there's a pattern in comparative cases where defendants with wealth and access can fight longer, appeal more, and attract resources that others can't. The law tries to be blind, but access and attention are not evenly distributed.
True. The appeals process corrected perceived errors, But an ordinary defendant might not have had the same ability to litigate for years. That raises real concerns about unequal justice.
Before we close, I want to ask you something a bit broader, Callum. As someone who's spent time both prosecuting and teaching, when you look at this case now, 10 years on, what stays with you most? What should remain with the public?
What stays with me is the fragility of certain certainties. When you're a prosecutor, you're trained to assemble discrete pieces into a coherent story: timeline, motive, means. This case shows how even with a mountain of media coverage and forensic testimony, reasonable people can disagree about the same set of facts because of tiny uncertainties: sound, angle, posture. It's a lesson in humility about proof and an argument for taking domestic violence seriously across the board. Also, and perhaps more quietly, I keep thinking of Reeva's voice. She wanted to speak out on violence. We owe that an echo. Policies, supports, and legal practices that reduce the likelihood another woman stands where she stood.
I agree. And for our listeners who already know the broad arc, I want to be candid. This episode isn't about sensationalizing. It's about saying, look, the law reached a formal outcome, but many moral, factual, and social questions are unresolved. We can ask them without glamorizing the killer. We can hold debate while centering the person who died. Callum, any final notes for people trying to think critically about this case without leaning into conspiracy or victim blaming?
Yes. Be careful with certainty. Accept that reasonable doubt is a legal and humane constraint. Ask institutional questions. Did procedures work? Did sentencing reflect societal values? And, importantly, support structural responses to gender-based violence, better policing, survivor-centered services, and wary attention to how celebrity can distort public understanding.
Thank you. And to listeners, if you're left wanting more nuance, our show notes will include timelines, links to legal analyses, and references to verdicts and SCA judgments so you can read for yourself. Before we sign off, a short tribute. Reeva once said, "If you are being abused, remember you are not alone. Swift help is available." We end with that admonition, not as a footnote, but as a call to care for people at risk. Soft music rises. This has been Still Unanswered. I'm Nadia Mokoena. Dr. Callum Hargreaves, thank you for joining me.
Thank you, Nadia. It was necessary. Difficult, but necessary.
If you've found this episode useful, please consider supporting survivors' charities and check the resources we've linked. And if you have thoughts or quiet corrections, write to us. Let's keep the conversation rigorous and respectful. Good night.